name is Kavita and I'm from IDP IELTS in Australia. I'm so excited to welcome you to the first webinar of our latest IELTS webinar series. It's great to see so many test takers join us from all over the world today. So welcome and thank you for choosing IELTS. I'm happy to also inform you that we have IELTS expert Don Oliver presenting an introduction to IELTS tonight. He will take you through the basics of IELTS, aiming to teach you everything you need to know about the test. We will end the webinar with a short Q&A session. So if you're joining via Zoom, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. And if you're joining us via Facebook, please leave your comments for Dawn and we'll try to answer as many as we can today. The Facebook recording of today's session will be available after this, so you can catch back on anything you may have missed. Without further ado, Dawn, take it away.
Thanks very much, KD. Lovely to see you again. And welcome to everybody who has joined us today for this introduction to IELTS. How to succeed at IELTS. Now, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you as much as I possibly can in the short time that we have. As Katie said, this is an introduction, really. And I'm going to tell you some of the basics about IELTS, but I think some of the most important things about IELTS. What is IELTS? We're going to look at that in some detail. IELTS has a big reputation. It has a great standing in the whole world, and I'll explain to you why that is. I'll explain the format of the test, what the test looks like, and we'll finish up by suggesting a few preparation tools, how you can do your best in the IELTS test. So what is IELTS? Well, it's all in the name. International is the first word in IELTS, and that means that it's not just a test from the UK, it's not just a test from Australia, but it's a test where the items are written maybe in the UK, maybe in Australia, maybe in America, maybe in New Zealand or Canada. The people who will be examining are in all of those countries too, and you will hear accents from those countries as well. So start practicing now. Practice listening to a variety of English accents. It's a system for testing English, and we don't give you a pass or a fail, we give you a score. And I'll go into that in some detail. It's a test of proficiency. And this is a difficult word, maybe, proficiency. It means how well you can communicate and how well you can understand what people are saying to you in English and what you're reading, how well you can understand that. It's the most popular English language test for every purpose, virtually, for work, for study, for migration. And one of the reasons why it is so popular is that it's been around for a long time, over 30 years now, but the integrity of the test has never been questioned. It is a secure test. Anyone, a university or a professional organization or a government department who looks at your score knows that this is your score. And they know what a score means. We'll talk about the scores in a minute. And that's why over 11,000 educational institutions and organizations throughout the world recognize an IELTS score. So preparing for your IELTS score, there are some things that you should do, and you know these things already, I'm sure. The first one, of course, is what IELTS test you need and what score you need. Now, there are more than one IELTS tests. There are two IELTS tests, and the first one is the academic test, which is for university entrance or professional registration. But there's also a general training test. And IELTS is unique in that it offers two versions of the test. We'll talk about that in some detail too. As well as deciding which test, you need to decide what score you need. And as I said before, it's not pass or fail. It's simply a score. Now, for some people, that score may be quite low. You might need a 4.5 to renew a visa, depending on your job. You might need a 5.5 or a 6 to enter university. You might need a 7 for other universities or for migration purposes. If you need registration as a teacher, you may have to show some 8s in your score. The important thing is that you find out from the organisation who is asking for a score, find out what they want. The format of the test I will explain to you in some detail, but you can find a lot of that information online, and I'll show you some of the important sites where you can look at that. And preparing for the test is not just doing practice tests, it's really improving your level of English. And that's something that you should do and can do every day. Finally, when you think you're ready, book a test date, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, all of those things are important. And let me explain a little bit more about what I said earlier about the two versions of the IELTS test. The academic version is very popular throughout the world. But in some parts of the world, where I come from, which is Australia, for example, the general training is probably more popular. And that is because it is used for migration purposes very often. But it can be used for to show an employer your level of English. It could be used for vocational education or professional registration. If you're entering university, then you will need an academic test. Okay. As well as having two versions of the test, academic and general training, we also offer the test in two different ways. You can do the test in front of a computer. Now, this is useful if you are comfortable using a computer and comfortable using all of the functions of a computer. If you know the keyboard well, if you are happy cutting and pasting in the reading test, for example, you will have headphones, which you can keep on throughout the test. But the important thing about the computer test is that you get your score more quickly than if you do the pencil and paper test. After 3 or 5 days, you will get your result, whereas the paper and pencil test, it will take 13 days to get your test result. Now, that's an important difference. Another important difference is that you can book a test date on many different days for the computer test, whereas for the paper test, it's usually on a Saturday. The other important difference is that in the computer testing, you will be with a small group of people, and there won't be a lot of paper to be picked up and distributed and handed back in. So it's a quicker test, simply because you don't have to stand around waiting for registration with a bunch of people and wait for paper to be distributed. But, and this is extremely important, the content of both the computer and the paper and pencil test is exactly the same. The same types of questions, the same length of time for answering the questions, and importantly, the speaking test for both is with an examiner in a quiet room where you can ask the examiner questions. Okay? That's important. Let's look at the test format in a little bit more detail. Now you can see here that it's a long test. It's nearly 3 hours. And that is one of the reasons why the IELTS test is respected. People know that it is a thorough test of a person's English. And that is good for you. You might think, oh, I wish it was a shorter test. But in fact, because it is a long and a thorough test, that means that your score is respected. People around the world will know if you've got a 6 or a 7, then they know exactly what that means and that you are capable of functioning in English. You'll see here that the listening is the first thing you do. But if you come from, if you are doing the test in Australia, the writing will be the first, okay? It doesn't matter. The order of the test does not matter. The speaking, for example, could be after the written test or it could be before the written test. But each part of the test takes the same length of time every time. So the listening takes 30 minutes and there are 40 questions. Importantly, you only hear the recording once. So you need to concentrate very carefully from the first minute to the last minute. The reading takes 60 minutes and there are 40 questions. Again, you need to be able to practice reading as quickly as you can. The writing is also 1 hour and there are 2 tasks. I'll talk about those in detail in a minute. And the speaking is always 3 parts and always about 14 minutes. No matter where you do the test, you could do it in Brazil, in Australia, in Saudi Arabia, in Vietnam. It doesn't matter. It is the same test. Okay. The IELTS scores that I was talking about, as I said, it's not a pass and a fail. You are just given a place on a scale. Now, if you are understanding most of what I say, you are not a band 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. You are probably a band 5 or 6 or maybe even better. You can see here that this is just a sketch, a summary of what a band 5 or a 6 or a 7 can do. A band 5 is somebody who has some ability in the language, but makes a lot of mistakes. They don't understand everything, but they can cope with most situations. And I imagine that many of you are about at band 5. A band 6 is more competent. They have a quite effective use of the language and they understand most situations, particularly familiar situations. A band 7 is a very competent user. They make only a few mistakes in their grammar, in their choice of words. They understand most of the things that are said to them and what they read. A band 8 and then a band 9. Now, I think I am a band 9, but I've been speaking English since I was about 2. And that's a long time. But I do know some people whose first language is not English and they have achieved a band 9. So it's possible for everybody with enough work, with patience. Okay, they are the scores that you are aiming for. And if you go to the IELTS website, you will find the public version of the assessment criteria that show what a band 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 can do in more detail. But let's begin now by looking at the writing. Now, the writing is pretty difficult in some parts. Usually, people find writing a little more difficult than speaking. Why? Well, it's because you can make many more mistakes when you write than when you speak. Your spelling, for example, your punctuation, your paragraphing. And as well, you may not answer the question fully or directly. You may not understand the question fully. In the speaking test, if you don't understand the question, the examiner will ask you again. But they can't do that in the writing. Let's look at the writing in some detail. This is an example of an academic writing task 1. Now, task 1 in academic writing is a task where you have to simply describe a visual piece of information. And here, the visual is a description of how bricks are made. You are always told what you are looking at. And here, you're told exactly what you're looking at. The diagram below shows the process by which bricks are manufactured for the building industry. And you look at that and you think, okay, I understand these things. They're doing something with clay, they're transforming it, they're adding something, sand and water, they're forming it, they're heating it, they're drying it, they're packaging it. Well, that's simple. And it is fairly simple. Practice looking at diagrams such as that, and that will be good practice for this type of academic task 1 task. The other academic task 1 task, which is very common, is to look at graphs, data, to look at charts, to look at pie charts, line graphs, tables of figures. When you see those in a newspaper or in your textbook, for example, think about how you would describe that information. Remember, it's all about describing. You don't have to explain it. There are some very good model answers to this task on our website, and I'll show you where to go later on. You have 20 minutes to do this, and you should write 150 words. The other task you have to do is a longer task. That is task 2. Now, in task 2, you are always asked to give your opinion about something. And always, you are given, first of all, a statement. Here, the statement is quite simple. The statement says, university graduates can earn more than less educated, well-educated members of the community. So it's fair for them to pay the full cost of their own studies. Okay, that's an issue that people talk about. In your country, in my country, the cost of a university education and who should pay. So you've probably got some ideas about this. But remember, you're asked a specific question now. And the specific question here is, do you agree or not? To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Okay, remember that. You need to actually address that question. So you say, I agree, or I completely disagree, or I partly agree. Wealthy students should pay, but poor students should not. Give your opinion, state your position. This is important in task 2 writing. Sometimes there are more difficult tasks. You might be asked to look at 2 different opinions, discuss them, and give your own opinion. You might be asked to explain why something happens and how something can be improved. Look at the task carefully and answer the task directly. You have 40 minutes to write this essay because it's 250 words. It's a longer essay. It's worth twice the marks of a task 1. Okay, that's academic. Now, general training writing is a little bit different. It's very different in task 1 because the task 1 in general training is to write a letter. You have the same length of time, 60 minutes. You have 20 minutes for task 1, 40 minutes for task 2. But in task 1 general training, you need to write a letter. And they will tell you a situation and you need to respond to that situation. It says here that you can use British or American spellings, and that's very true. Remember what I said? It's an international English language test. And in fact, where I come from, Australia, a lot of Australians mix English spelling with American spelling. Not a problem. Let's look at a task for general training task 1. And this is a very typical task. You are always told what the situation is. And here it says you have heard about plans to build new apartments in a public park near your home. You want to give your opinion about this. Always you are given a situation, but please understand the situation. Spend a couple of minutes looking at this very carefully. Don't just start writing without fully understanding what you have to do. And you have to write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, a formal letter. You do not know this person. You have to be polite and formal. And you have to cover 3 points. How did you learn about the plan? My friend told me. Say what you think of the park. We love the park. Give your opinion of the plans for the apartment. I don't mind. People have to live somewhere. That's a good answer. Always remember to start your letter in the way that we suggest. Here, dear sir or madam, because it's a formal letter. Sometimes it's an informal letter. You're writing to your friend and you will start that letter, Dear Ali, Dear Wing. You make up the name. In task 2 in the general training, it's very similar to the academic. The academic task 2 is asking for an opinion about a subject which is maybe a little bit more academic. And general training task 2 is asking for an opinion which is maybe a little bit less academic. In this case, it's about people eating different types of food and not getting enough exercise. Here, your task is to give causes for the problem and give solutions to these problems. In fact, this task is more difficult in some ways than the academic task 2, because here it's not just I agree or disagree. It's there's a cause for eating unhealthy food. There is a cause of taking less exercise. There is a solution to the eating problem, and there is a solution to the exercise problem. You're doing 4 things in this essay. 250 words and 40 minutes. Always check your writing at the end, in case you made a few little mistakes. Okay, that's writing. Let's look at reading now. Now, the reading in academic and general training are different as well. The reading in both is 60 minutes, and there are 3 sections and 40 questions. But the academic reading is looking at 3 passages which are about 900 words each, which is about 1 page of a news magazine. Have you read Time magazine or Newsweek? Or have you read New Scientist magazine? Do this because they are good examples of a passage in an academic reading test. About 900 words, similar type of subjects. You don't have to have special knowledge. These are subjects of general interest. But you need to be able to practice reading them as quickly as you can because you only have 1 hour to answer 40 questions. In the general training, you have the same amount of words, which is about 2,500 words to read, but you have shorter passages. You might have 6 passages, but they will be things like a group of advertisements or a group of instructions or rules. Some of them will be related to your work, safety rules in your job, how to exit the building, for example. Practice looking at those things wherever you are in English, brochures from the supermarket, rules are on the wall in your workplace. If you have those things in English, that is very good practice for general training reading. Okay. The important thing about the reading test is we give you a lot of words and not much time. That's how we know you are able to read efficiently. And you need to practice reading efficiently. Because you have so many words, you need to choose what you're going to read. And in order to choose efficiently, you need to practice skimming and scanning. Skimming is what you do now when you're reading a newspaper in your own language. You look at the front page, you don't read every word. You quickly read the headlines, you look at the pictures, you look at the first sentence in a paragraph, you look at the first paragraph and the last paragraph. It gives you an idea of what it's about. Do I want to read that? No. But I do want to read that. That's skimming. Now you know how to do it in your first language. Practice doing it in English. It means focusing on the start of paragraphs, the headings, the pictures, the final paragraph, because that will sum something up. Do those things, and that will help you with this skill. The other skill is scanning, and that means you look at the questions that you have to answer in the IELTS reading test and figure out what are the key words that I'm looking for. Am I looking for a date? Am I looking for a place? Am I looking for a person? Am I looking for a comparison? More than, less than? Finding a key word will really help you focus on where the answer is. And a tip, the answers in most cases come in the same order as the questions in IELTS. Not always, but in most cases. So if you find the answer to question 23 in the passage, the answer to question 24 will be a little bit after that, not before it. And finally, you do need to read for detail. And that's something that you can also practice. It means working out the tense. Did this happen in the past? Is it going to happen in the future? Does it happen every day? What preposition is being used? Is it by? Is it with? Is it for? Is it after? All of these things are reading for detail. Now, this is a skill you already have, but don't just practice that, practice the other skills as well. All right, that's reading. But let me, before we finish with reading, let me just remind you that there are different question types in IELTS, and that's one of the reasons why IELTS is respected. It's not just multiple choice, A, B, or C. It's a bunch of different types of questions which thoroughly test your ability to understand what you read. Do you see these different types of questions? Multiple choice, identifying, matching, completion, short answer. Some of them have that little star next to them, the asterisk, multiple choice, identifying, short answer. That means that the answers come in the same order as the question. Practice these sorts of questions in the preparation material, but the biggest thing you can do is to learn more words. The more words you know in English, the easier you're reading, the easier you're listening. Okay, let's move on now to listening. I don't know what that guy's listening to, but he's very happy. You should be listening to English on your iPhone, on your iPad, or whatever it is that you listen to things on. Even if you don't understand everything, it will help you pick up little things all the time. And it will help you pick up the rhythm of English, which can also help your speaking. So the listening part might be the third part of the written test. It might be the first part of the written test. It doesn't matter. But it will always have 4 sections. And the first section is 2 people discussing something. 2 people having an everyday conversation. Where shall we meet for coffee? Something like that. The second part will be 1 person giving information, maybe telling you about a museum or a program on the radio. The third part will be 3 or maybe 4 people discussing something that is academic, an essay that they have to write for university, perhaps. And finally, the fourth part, maybe the most challenging part, will be listening to someone like me giving a lecture, talking about a subject which is a little bit more complicated, but interesting, and where they are giving you information, not very technical information, but a little bit more technical. You get 10 minutes to transfer your answers onto the answer sheet when you do the paper and pencil test. So please use that time. But when you do the computer test, you don't get the 10 minutes, okay? Because you put your answers straight onto the screen. So remember that. Don't expect to get extra time. Okay. Finally, the speaking. My favorite. Everyone loves speaking, right? And one of the good things about IELTS is that you get to speak in a quiet room with only one other person. And believe me, this one other person, the examiner, wants you to perform well. They want you to succeed. So they will help as much as they can. They can't give you words, but they will repeat questions. They will answer your question. If you don't understand something, say, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Or what does that word mean? And they will tell you. Take your time, relax. The 3 parts of the speaking test are quite clear. They are quite regular. They are the same no matter where you do the test. 5 minutes will be spent asking you questions about yourself. simple questions about what you like, what you don't like, where you live, what you do, what you eat, how you travel, etc. About your friends, about your country. It's about you. Now, you should be able to speak about these things. But remember, the examiner will always follow up with a difficult question. And that question is, why? So you might say, well, my favorite food is falafel. Why? Be ready to answer that question. Because my mother used to make it for me when I was a child, and I've always liked it. Good answer. The second part is where you have to talk for 2 minutes about a simple thing. It might be about a person. It might be about a place. It might be about an object or an event. The examiner will say, now I would like you to describe a place where you often go to be alone, perhaps. You choose where you go. They might ask you about a person that you know. You choose which person you're going to talk about. So practice doing this every day. For 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about my laptop for 2 minutes. I'm going to talk about my dinner for 2 minutes. I'm going to talk about my wife for 2 minutes. This is good practice for the second part of the speaking test. And always remember too, to spend 1 minute making some notes, because this is given to you. 1 minute to prepare. And it's a skill. If you make good notes, then you should be able to speak quite easily for 2 minutes on a subject. And finally, the examiner will ask to discuss in general terms a topic. So for example, the example I gave earlier on about part 2, where you might have to discuss, where you might have to describe a person you know, or an object that you have, or your laptop, for example. In part 3, the examiner will say, well, we've been talking about your laptop. Now let's talk about technology or information, etc. Now, this is probably the more difficult part of the test, because you have to speak with some sophistication. That means not just simple words, not just simple structures, but you need to be able to talk about what will happen in the future. You need to be able to say whether something is good or bad, or whether something should change, or if something didn't change, what would happen then. Practice doing this. Practice discussing issues with your friends, the environment, education, the health system in your country, the traffic in your city. These are important subjects, and that's what part 3 is about. Okay. All of those things are important, and so you need to prepare for them. Now, IELTS can give you some support in preparing. There are some very useful writing tips that you can find in video form, speaking tips also, videos. We can give you some speaking test samples. If you go to our official YouTube site, you will see what a band 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 look like. You can practice doing the computer delivered test. There will be tutorials for those things. You can look at some of the past webinars where you'll see me and a bunch of other people giving good advice about IELTS, and also look at how other introductions to IELTS and also tips about improving. That's at the youtube.com website, and you will find the IELTS Essentials tag there. There's another important promotion which is very useful. It's the IELTS Macquarie preparation course. Now, I have looked at this very carefully, and it is a very thorough, comprehensive, complete description of the test with exercises about improving your performance in the test. So you get this for free when you book a test. So take advantage of that. Maybe book the test sometime before you're actually going to do the test, so you get full advantage with this preparation course. Okay, there's another important thing that you can access, and that is the IELTS Progress Check. Now, it's much cheaper than a real IELTS test, and the result you get is not official, but it will give you a good idea of where you are. If you want to get a 6 or a 7, for example, in the real IELTS test, and you do this progress check, and you're getting about a 6, well, you should feel confident about doing the real test. But if you're only getting a 4 or a 5 in this, well, that's okay, but you need to practice a little bit more. You're able to practice all 4 parts of the test, and you will receive a score for all 4 parts. And it's not just the bloke down the road marking this. These are IELTS experts, so their advice you can trust. You will receive official detailed feedback about both the academic and the general training test. Other things that we can share with you are the at the official IDP IELTS one-stop shop, IELTS Prepare. The link is there at the bottom of the screen. Remember that. Go to it and you'll find a lot of different things. Some of the things that I talked about already, but other things as well. You'll also be able to look at things like our Facebook page and other things like that, which I'll get to in a moment. But I'd like to finish up rather quickly now and just remind you that learning a language is not done quickly. So be realistic. You've already done hundreds of hours of study of English because you understand most of what I'm saying. You might need to do hundreds more before you get the score you want. But that's okay. It takes a long time to learn a language well. So push yourself. But one thing you do know with IELTS is that it is a fair test of your English. And because it's a big test of your English, anything that you learn in English, it might be a phrase from a song, it might be something in a podcast, it might be from a YouTube video, that will help you improve your performance in IELTS, because that is what IELTS is all about. As I said before, there is a Facebook page you can go to where lots of questions have been answered and where you can ask questions. TikTok as well. We can also find lots of support on YouTube, as I've already said, and practical tips at IELTS.idp.com. Okay, the next webinar will be in a couple of weeks, and that will be all about IELTS reading. And I hope if you want to know more about reading, please tune into that, because that will be full of more information. Now, KD, I am ready to answer some of those difficult questions that you've got lined up.
Sure thing. Thank you, Don. That was a lot of great tips and detailed explanations. So that was Amazing. So let's get to the questions now. So first one is about writing. Someone asked, what type of linkers should I use in task 1 of general training IELTS?
That's a very good question. Remember, general training task 1 is a letter. It may depend on whether it's a formal letter or an informal letter. Now, if it's an informal letter, you're writing to your friend, you're inviting them to your party, right? The sorts of linkers you might use will be quite informal. And by the way, and remember, yes, of course, things like that. If you're writing a formal letter, you will be using some rather more formal language. And furthermore, as a matter of fact, in contrast, those sorts of phrases are linking phrases, but they are more formal. Practice reading informal letters in English and formal letters in English, and you'll get an idea of the tone, because tone is one of the assessment criteria in general training task 1.
Great, thank you. And the next question is about reading. Someone said, I find reading really hard. And even in mock tests, I get nervous. Can you give me any tips on how I could do better at it?
Yes. When you're nervous, one reason you get nervous is that you feel you're not very good at it. So one way to get to lose your nerves is to get good at something. And I've already mentioned that learning more words will make reading easier. So learn words systematically every day. Set yourself a target, 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 words, and use them. The more you use words, the better you'll remember them. And not just one word, but groups of words together. And you will start to hear and read those words more and more. That's one way of getting rid of your nerves, because you'll feel more confident. But of course, sometimes you do know how to read, but you still get nervous in an exam situation. Well, there are ways to get around that. Maybe visualizing, meditation, things like that. Google it. Find some good advice, some good professional advice. How do I deal with nerves in an exam situation? And you will find a lot of good advice. And that'll also be good practice reading.
That's a great tip. Thank you, Don. Someone asked, can you tell me the difference between general training and academic reading? And then a little more about general training reading.
Yep. The difference, I did mention that the number of words is the same for general training and academic. But in the academic reading, you will have 3 passages only. And each of those passages, you should spend about 20 minutes on them. And they are about 900 words. And it's a similar level of difficulty to what you might find in a serious newspaper or news magazine, or things like popular science or popular economics magazines, things like that. So practice looking at those things. If you are living in a country that has an English language daily newspaper, the Jakarta Post in Indonesia, I was there, and also in the Middle East, there are English language newspapers everywhere. Make that a habit, reading those things. But basically, 40 questions on 3 passages in academic. In the general training, you'll have shorter passages. In fact, they won't be, there'll be 1 passage like the academic, but the first 2 sections will be shorter groups of words. And as I said before, it might be a bunch of advertisements. It might be a bunch of job advertisements, for example. And basically, it's less academic, but it's also challenging. And the question types are exactly the same for both academic and general training.
Thanks, Don. One more question on reading. Someone asked, can we use capital or lowercase t for true and capital or lowercase f for false?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes and yes. A capitalization is not assessed in your reading answers or in your listening answers. So even if it's a proper noun, a person's name, you can use lowercase. If it's true, you can put capital T or lowercase t. But be careful that your lowercase t looks like a T and not an F, right? This is important. Be very careful that it's clear what you're writing.
Thank you. Let's take a look at the next question. All righty. Okay, someone asked, do we have to be casual or formal during a speaking test?
There is a lot of scope for being as formal as you like or being pretty casual. Your examiners are experienced teachers who have taught a lot. They have probably lived and worked in many foreign countries, speak other languages as well. They know the custom in the language in the country where you live, and they are quite comfortable in most English-speaking countries with a lot of informality. English language culture is pretty informal. So you can talk to your boss using their first name in Australia, in America, places like that. So they're quite comfortable with informality. But don't be rude and don't use swear words, right? And don't use too many slang words. I would recommend you go somewhere in the middle between very formal and very informal.
That's a great tip, Don. Thank you. Okay, a few people have asked some practical tips about reading passages, how they can read it a bit quicker. Any advice from you, Don?
Well, the things that I mentioned earlier on are skimming, that is practicing reading a whole page in a minute. Now that sounds impossible, but in fact it's something that you can do. You won't understand everything, but you'll get an idea of the way things are organized on that page and where the main information might be and what the general gist, that means the basic idea, is. Scanning, looking at the questions first and finding a key word, the date, the place, the person, the time, etc. Those are skills that you can practice and they will help you become more efficient as a reader. But I go back to what I said earlier on about learning more words and make that a priority, learning new words every day and practicing using them every day, because that will increase your reading speed, your listening ability, and also your ability to write and speak.
Yeah, thanks, Don. So someone here has asked for writing task 2, we are asked for our opinion, whether we agree or disagree about something. So do we only state our opinion or do I provide both viewpoints?
If the question is to what extent do you agree or disagree, you're not really asked to discuss both views. You can answer that question quite competently, quite effectively by saying, I completely agree with this for these reasons. You have to support your opinion. Now that's up to a band 8. You can do that. But at a band 9, the examiner has to think, could anything be added to improve this answer? And really, if you haven't really even looked at the opposite view, then the examiner will think, well, that would have improved the essay. You don't have to spend a lot of time with the opposite view, but if you acknowledge that there is an opposite view and it's wrong, then that's okay. Do that. So as a general rule, to what extent do you agree or disagree? You don't have to give both sides. But if you want to have a really, really good answer, I would recognize that both sides should be addressed up to a point.
Perfect. Thank you, Don. Moving on to speaking. Someone asked in the speaking test, I tend to get nervous and I can't think of anything to say. So is it okay to pause while thinking what's the right thing to say and what's the best way to make good impression?
Absolutely. And pausing is a part of human speech. Everyone pauses. I'll do it now. You see? Now that's okay. But how long are you going to pause for? That's an important thing. If it goes like that, then that might be a problem, because the examiner will say, well, you're not very fluent. Now, fluency is one of the assessment criteria. And fluency means you are able to continue without too much hesitation. But everyone pauses when they're trying to think of the right word or an idea. If you do that 2 or 3 times, that's all right, not a problem. But can I recommend that you learn a few phrases to fill up the pauses? For example, that's a very interesting question. Let me think about that. Well, I suppose there must be many reasons. I haven't answered the question, but I have filled up the space with perfect English. And that's something that you can practice, and you can have that little thing in your pocket, and just not literally in your pocket, but just have it in your head and be able to bring it out to give yourself time to think.
That's great advice. I tend to pause a lot too. So that's good. Another one from someone asking, if I don't know any facts to answer a question in the speaking test, is it okay if I make up 1 or 2 facts that are believable?
It's always best to tell the truth, I think, because here's an English idiom. What a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Replay the recording and check that out. You can produce a lot of English explaining why you don't know anything about something. And remember, in a speaking test, the main thing is the examiner wants to hear you speaking English. So if you say, well, the question is, to tell me about a book that you've read. You say, well, I never read books. I find them boring. I like to read manga and also watch YouTube videos. That's fine. I've produced some beautiful English there and have said nothing about books because I don't know anything about books. So I think that that's probably the best policy. Instead of saying, oh, yes, there was this book that I read. It's difficult to make up stuff like that.
Sure thing. Thank you so much. Next one. Would the examiner ask us any questions in part 2 of the speaking? I heard some do and some do not.
That's true. Some do and some do not. But it's only one question. And it's at the end of your 2 minutes. So at the end of your 2 minutes, the examiner can, but doesn't have to, ask you a rounding off question. So you've been talking about someone you know and like, and the examiner might say, do other people like this person? Or they might simply say, thank you, can I have the paper and the pencil? Doesn't matter.
Cool, thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming from Facebook and Zoom. Let's see if I can find another one. Oh, this is a cool one. What about putting emphasis on the wrong syllable, like pronouncing emphasis on the wrong syllable?
That's right, very good. That is a problem because one of the assessment criteria is pronunciation. And part of the assessment of pronunciation is that you can stress the correct syllable in a word and the correct word in a sentence and use intonation to express meaning or emotion. You go up or you go down. So if you do say emphasis, then that is a problem because it's not clear what word you're saying. And if you have a problem with emphasizing the right syllable, practice those words. And when you learn a word, make a mark under the syllable that is stressed. So don't just write down the English word, write down the English word and a little mark where the emphasis goes.
Thank you, Don. And one last question before we wrap up. Would using American or British spelling pose an issue? More importantly, using both same essay?
It's very unlikely that you would spell the same word in two different ways in an essay. That's unlikely. But if you have an American spelling for one word and a British spelling for another word, not a problem. Why? Because I do that sometimes too. In Australia, we do that. The Labor Party in Australia, L-A-B-O-R. In the Labor Party in England is L-A-B-O-U-R. But we write the word realise, I-S-E, instead of I-Z-E. So we mix them up. It's perfectly okay.
Well done, Don. That wraps our session for this evening. Thank you for joining us for today's masterclass. We truly appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and asked a question. If we didn't get a chance to answer any of your questions, make sure to message us directly and we'll answer it. So have a great day, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everybody.